Hey guys and gals, I hope you are doing well. It's your friendly neighborhood Dr. O here again to talk about the history of cognitive science. This is going to come at you in two parts. So, the first, we're going to talk about some ancient fellas, and then in the second part, we'll talk about some not so ancient fellas. Um, okay, so let's get started. This is really the plan of the next couple of lectures. So this is a pre-Renaissance, post-Renaissance timeline. We won't be going through all of these names, don't panic. We'll cover this part of things in this lecture and this part of things in the next lecture. We'll start with the very first mention of the brain over here in E. Smith's surgical papyrus, and we'll end up over here with Broca talking about some really great primary evidence of functional localization. All right, so in 1700 BC, we find the first written mention of the brain on this really old papyrus written in hieroglyphics. It's most likely a copy of a much older manuscript, as if this weren't old enough, right? There's probably a manuscript that's twice as old that this one is actually a copy of, right? 48 case studies mentioned in this papyrus. 27 were head injuries. Those are the ones that obviously interest us the most. And the way that they diagnosed these case studies was they had three diagnostic categories. Everything fell into one of these three categories. Okay, so here they are. You either had an ailment which I'll treat, so I think I know what this is, I'm going to go ahead and treat it. An ailment with which I will contend, so I'm not sure what this is, but I'm going to go ahead and try to treat it. And an ailment not to be treated. In other words, I have no idea what this is, I don't know how to treat it, it's probably going to kill you, so we're not going to treat it. Cool. Okay. So they had some really great treatments already as far back as 1700 BC and earlier. These included bandages, stitching, cauterization, splints. They used honey to prevent infection, which is clever because honey has antibacterial properties. They used surgical dressings. They used raw meat to stop bleeding, which was actually interestingly used in a surgery about 7 years ago on a young girl. She had a nosebleed that was going on for days. It was essentially going to kill her. And they put a piece of cured pork on the vessel that had burst. And this essentially stopped the bleeding. This was something that they did in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the doctor said, let's go ahead and give it a shot because we've tried everything else. And lo and behold, it worked. I don't know how, I don't know why, something cool for you to look up. You could even put this in your interaction topic. Okay, so some of the cool symbols that we see in this scroll are things like hieroglyphics for the brain, hieroglyphics for corrugations of the brain, which they said were, quote, corrugations which form molten copper. And these were they were referring to the convolutions of the brain of the cortex, right? They talked about the membrane in a, quote, membrane enveloping the brain. These are the meninges, or the coverings of the brain that they were referring to. They talked about fluid in the interior of the head. That's the cerebrospinal fluid that they were referring to. So they made a lot of really cool observations all the way back then about the brain. Really great start. So this was an era when the mind was thought to be located in the heart and not in the brain. And I tell you this because this is a very prominent recurring theme in the history of cognitive science, of psychology, of any science that centers around the mind or the brain. Okay. So next, we get to Alcmaeon. I'm not really quite sure how to pronounce his name. Take your pick. Okay. So he's in Sicily about 510 BC. He's considered the first neuroscientist, the father of neuroscience, because he thought that the brain was the seat of perception and cognition. Why did he think that? He did some anatomical dissections of animal eyes, or at least he participated in them from the evidence that we have. We don't know all the details of his life because it was very long ago. We do know he was either a physician or a scientific philosopher. He practiced astrology and meteorology. and he participated in, medical practices like dissections of eyes. So he observed that the optic nerve leads to the brain, and therefore concluded that perceptual processes must be in the brain, because I have all of this information coming into my eyes, and that information is physically hooked up to my brain. Okay, so go him. Now we come to Hippocrates, and this name probably sounds familiar to quite a few of you, in the form of the Hippocratic Oath. Right? He is in about 460 to 370 BC. Remember, time goes backwards. He's in Greece, and he's considered the father of medicine. Okay, he was a physician. He was the first to kind of propose that medicine needs to be a discipline of its own. Like, let's separate it from theology. Let's separate it from all the God talk. Let's separate it from philosophy and just treat it as its own science. So he took a very scientific approach to medicine, and he took a very medically ethical approach to medicine, which is where we get the Hippocratic Oath, because it wasn't written by him, but it was very much a reflection of his medical ethics. Excuse me. He established the first medical school, the Hippocratic School of Medicine, because he was so intent on insisting that medicine be considered its own profession. So we owe a lot to Hippocrates. Okay, moving along, we get to Aristotle, another name that will probably be familiar to even more of you. He was a philosopher back in the day in Greece, 384 to 322 BC, philosopher and a biologist. He founded comparative anatomy, zoology, embryology, formal logic. He dissected all kinds of animals, from snails to elephants, and compared what he saw, which was a fantastic beginning for comparative biology and anatomy, anything. He did this very systematic study of animal behavior. It was fantastic. But he was heart-centric. Dang it. So we've gone backwards now. We're back into the heart is what controls sensation. And I'll give it to him. Aristotle made some pretty decent observations that led him to this conclusion that the heart controls sensation. Okay. So here are his comparisons, right? So the heart is affected by emotion, right? You can be heartbroken. You can feel it in your chest when somebody breaks your heart. The brain's not affected by these kinds of things, according to Aristotle. All animals have hearts. Not all animals have brains. The heart is the source of blood. The brain is bloodless. The heart is warm. The brain is cold. The heart is connected with all the sense organs. The brain is not. The heart is essential for life. The brain is not. The heart is formed first. The brain is second, therefore first loser. The heart is sensitive. If you were to poke it, it would hurt. The brain is insensitive. If you were to poke an exposed brain of a living animal, it would not hurt. The heart is in a central location and the brain is not. Okay, so this combination of evidence led him to believe that the heart is indeed what controls sensation. Now, we know a lot of these things about the brain just aren't true. But he was working with what he had. Remember our microwave example with Newton. He was working with what he had. Okay. So, let's skip forward to Galen. And Galen was a physician. He was a surgeon. He was a philosopher over in Turkey. Now we are AD, right? So he's 129 to 200 AD. He did animal dissections. And these were good in the sense of he gave the first really detailed and correct diagrams of the brain. He also did some lesion studies, so some of the very first lesion studies. Slightly horrifying lesion studies. So what he did was the pig vocalization studies. So it was the squealing pig experiment. He would cut open a pig As it's squealing in pain, he would cut the vocal cords and go, hey, look, you can't hear it squealing in pain anymore. Therefore, the vocal cords are responsible for vocalization. Yes, this is a great conclusion, but still a horrifying methodology. Okay. Here we are again with the soul is located. Well, we're back to the brain, but now things are located in the ventricles of the brain, which is, it's definitely not. I mean, if I had to choose between the ventricles and the heart, I'd probably choose the heart because there's more going on in the heart than there is in the ventricles, right? Ventricles are full of CSF. That's what they are. That's what they do. Okay. So here's the last bit of this particular lecture. The black hole of history. And here's my little, this is like, seriously, this is where all common sense and reason and logic and science and it just all flew out the window here. Okay. Knowledge became in some sense dangerous. This was the time where Galileo was sentenced to life in prison, life under house arrest, because he realized that the earth is not the center of the universe. Things don't revolve around us. We revolve around the sun. And people were not happy with this idea, right? So he wasn't, contrary to popular belief, he was not killed for this idea. He was sentenced to life in house arrest. They believed things like the medieval cell doctrine in this black hole of time. Right? So they believed in things like, well, there are ventricles from the front to the back. And the front is all about common sense and imagination. And the middle is all about reason and thought. And the back here is all about memory. And the reason why we know this, they said, is because, here we go. If we enter into any serious thought, we knit the brows and draw them up, right? So common sense and thought, and it must be here, right? If we remember anything, you put your head down. We hang down the head and rub the hinder part. So you put your head down, you rub the back of your head. So memory must be located back here. And these guys talk to each other via this middle ventricle, and that's the brain. Yay! So, very much lacking in any kind of scientific merit, any kind of realistic observation, any kind of anatomical underpinnings whatsoever. So, a very frustrating time for science and for knowledge. But don't fret, things will pick up in the next lecture when people start to get smart again and realize that they were on the right track before they started talking about brows furrowing and rubbing the back of your head, and that's where memory is. So that's what we'll talk about in the next lecture, the major post-Renaissance people that really guided humanity out of the darkness. So I will see you in the next lecture.